All right, today we're diving headfirst into one of the most tangled and, honestly, controversial ideas in all of Islamic theology, the doctrine of abrogation. It's a concept that was created to solve a really big problem, but as the research shows, it might have ended up creating an even bigger mess.
Just think about this for a second. What would you do if you had a holy book, one you believe is the perfect, direct word of God, but it seemed to contradict itself? Or it seemed to clash with other texts you also hold sacred? This isn't some abstract thought experiment. This was the exact dilemma facing the earliest Islamic scholars, and it pushed them to come up with a theological solution that would have massive consequences for centuries to come.
So let's paint a picture of the scene. We're in the 3rd century of the Islamic calendar, a couple hundred years after the Prophet's death. The massive collections of Sahih Hadith, those super authenticated reports about what the Prophet Muhammad said and did, have just been officially compiled. For the very first time, scholars, the ulama, had this huge body of text they had to make sense of, not just with the Quran, but with itself. And, well, they started finding some pretty major inconsistencies.
So you can see they had a real problem on their hands. How do you possibly resolve these conflicts? You can't just throw out a verse from the Quran, and you can't ignore a hadith that's been painstakingly verified. Doing either would shake the very foundations of the religion. They needed a tool, some kind of legal mechanism to smooth out the rough edges and keep the divine message whole. And that necessity, well, it became the mother of a pretty tangled invention.
And that invention, the solution the ulama came up with, was the doctrine of abrogation. In Arabic, it's called naskh. Now, on the surface, it sounds kind of elegant, right? It was a way to explain why some rules from God seemed to change over the 23 years the Quran was being revealed. The idea was simple. God reveals a new rule that just supersedes an older one. But here's where it gets really serious. Pay close attention to this definition. According to the scholarly research, for most of the classical ulama, naskh wasn't just about updating or replacing a rule. It meant the permanent obliteration of it. Think about that. A verse in the Quran, the word of God, could be declared legally null and void, forever. Now, they didn't see this as God correcting a mistake, but more like a deliberate, gradual process of revealing the law.
And from there, things got complicated, fast. All the major Sunni schools of law, the madhabs, were okay with one part of the Quran abrogating another. But then, most of them went down a much more controversial path, what's called cross-genre abrogation. This is the truly mind-bending idea that a Sahih Hadith, a report passed down through human beings, could actually cancel out a verse from the Quran itself, the literal word of God. The different schools couldn't even agree on which kind of hadith had that much power. And this, right here, is where the whole thing starts to become a real muddle.
So what happens when your tool for creating clarity actually ends up creating, as one source calls it, a hot mess of disagreement? The doctrine of naskh, which was supposed to untangle all these knots, ended up becoming a tangled knot itself. It led to this deep, profound uncertainty about some of the most basic laws of the faith.
And this quote from a leading modern scholar really gets to the heart of the problem. Deciding which verse canceled out which was rarely clear-cut. There weren't any objective rules. As the quote says, it often came down to a scholar's personal inclination, basically their gut feeling. And when the divine law can be changed based on a gut feeling, well, it stops feeling so stable.
This slide right here is the perfect snapshot of the muddle we're talking about. Look at this. You've got two of the most respected modern scholars of Islamic law, and they can't even agree on something as basic as which of the major schools rejected this idea of a hadith trumping the Quran. One says it was the Shafi'is, the other says the Hanafis. I mean, if the top experts today are confused about who believed what, just imagine the chaos over the centuries. It really shows you how deep this confusion goes.
And check out this timeline. It's wild. It shows just how unstable this whole doctrine has been. Back in the day, some scholars were claiming hundreds of verses were abrogated. You see Ibn Salama there in the 11th century with 238. But look what happens over time. The numbers just plummet. By the 16th century, the famous scholar al-Suidi says, no, it's only 20. Then a couple centuries later, Shah Wali Allah brings it down to just 5. It makes you wonder, right? How can a divine legal tool change that dramatically depending on the century?
At one point, some scholars were claiming as many as 500 verses of the Quran were no longer valid. 500. That's nearly a tenth of the entire book.
It really drives home the point that this wasn't some minor, precise tool. In the hands of some early ulama, abrogation was more like a sledgehammer, and it posed a real threat to the idea of Quranic integrity.
Okay, so this brings us to the big so what question. Why does any of this academic stuff matter? Well, because this isn't just a debate for dusty libraries. The doctrine of Naskh has had very real and sometimes very dangerous consequences in the real world, shaping everything from how different religions interact to how people live their daily lives.
Let's take this famous verse from Surah 2, verse 62. It's this incredibly open-armed statement about religious pluralism. It basically says that anyone who believes in God and the last day and does good deeds, whether they're Jewish, Christian, whatever, they'll get their reward from God. It sounds like a clear path to salvation for any good person who believes in one God.
But for a lot of traditionalist scholars, that path is blocked. They argue that this beautiful, inclusive verse has been abrogated, canceled, nullified by later verses revealed during a time of war, especially one known as the Ayat as-Saif, the sword verse. Now, the source material argues these verses were originally about self-defense, but were later used to cancel out dozens of other verses about peace and tolerance, completely changing the tone of the religion's message.
Here's another classic example the ulama point to, the prohibition of alcohol. They see a clear step-by-step process in the Quran. First, it's just an observation. Then, it's a warning that the harm is greater than the benefit. After that comes a specific restriction. Don't pray when you're intoxicated. And finally, you get the last word on the subject, a verse telling believers to just shun it entirely. For the ulama, this timeline is the perfect proof of abrogation in action. That final verse in step 4 simply cancels out everything that came before it. So with all this mess and all these dangerous outcomes, it's no surprise that modern critics are starting to question the whole idea. Let's look at how the research we're drawing from suggests we could just cut right through this complicated knot. The perspective laid out in our source material, which is called BioIslam, makes a pretty bold claim. It argues that the whole doctrine of Naskh is just flawed. It's not some divine mechanism, it's a human invention, created by scholars to solve a complex mess that they themselves had created. The argument goes that you can actually solve these textual conflicts using other methods, like looking at the Quran's own internal context, and, when that's not enough, by turning to science, which is seen as another form of God's ongoing guidance.
And that leaves us with one last, very powerful and pretty challenging question. If Naskh was this amazing, God-given tool for evolving the law and making it better over time, why didn't the ulama ever use it to get rid of things that most people today find completely unacceptable? The sources point out there was never any serious move by classical scholars to use Naskh to abrogate verses related to Rin slavery or wife beating. And asking why not, well, that might just be the most profound and unsettling challenge the entire doctrine of abrogation leaves us with.